Hello, everyone. A very good evening to all of you.
Hello. I'm audible, right? শোনা যাচ্ছে?
Yes.
ঠিক আছে, ভালো ভালো. Okay.
So I think that we all are here.
Yeah, I'll just set things up a bit.
Dr. Garima Dalal is here with us. She is the chair of this session. Dr. Garima Dalal is an assistant professor in the Linguistic Empowerment Cell, JNU, and she is also a pass out from CES, JNU. Hello. Hello, ma'am.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Yes, I am.
So, all right. So, here you are. And
let me correct you. I am a pass out of CLIN, which is Center for Linguistics.
Right.
So
right.
I date back to the time when we had the Center for English and Linguistic Studies. So
Okay.
Later they got divorced and we were in separate centers. I've seen both the time.
Right, right. So I apologize for that bit of misinformation because, yes, I should have remembered that. Okay, so so please take over from here.
Thank you. May I know how much time would each presenter have?
Each presenter has 20 minutes.
Great.
And we would love to stick to time because it's already quite late in the evening and
Sure.
many of us might be very impatient.
Great. So I'm honored to be a part of this conference, and without much ado, I would like to call upon Dr. Swati Moitra. She's an assistant professor at the Department of English at Gurudas College, University of Calcutta. She has taught at Miranda House and Shivaji College, which are both colleges which come under the University of Delhi. And she has also served as guest lecturer at Narsi Mohanji Institute of Management Studies, a very well-known name. Her areas of interest include book history, histories of readership, and digital internet cultures. She's a 2022 recipient of the Sharp Research Development Grant for BIPOC scholars. So I welcome you, Swati, and over to you. You have 20 minutes. I will switch off my screen and will be back in 20 minutes. So you know that you have 2 or 3 minutes to wind up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Dalal. I must thank everybody here for, especially Madhuri, for convening this wonderful event and for, getting us all here, and to the institution itself, for hosting us. It would have been lovely to be there in person, but nonetheless, the web format does allow us to be in various places. What I'll do now is I'll share my screen, and I'll hope, fingers crossed, that it is visible and not there are no technical difficulties. And with that, I'll start presenting. Now, I've titled this discussion Frontier Songs, and therefore I should explain what I mean by the term frontier. Now, in Borders, History's Existences, Paula Banerjee quotes the work of A.E. Moody, the political geographer, whose distinction between borders and frontiers pointed out that borders are boundary lines, while frontiers might be deemed boundary regions. So we're engaging with regions here. Now, despite their ostensible similarity, frontiers are zones at the periphery of a political control, which in the last 2 centuries have been slowly replaced by boundaries or lines of political control, which became the border. Now, this is a crucial conceptual distinction for border studies as well as for studies of the frontier. In South Asian context, Paula Banerjee further points out that large parts of the Indian subcontinent were bordered by seas and oceans. But there were no centralized regimes which ruled over the entire land area. And so therefore one does not hear of a South Asian marker of frontiers in that sense. There was a singular lack of such markers. Pillar inscriptions were usually meant to spread the message of the emperor throughout his empire and were not constructed to mark frontiers. Now, this lack of South Asian markers of frontiers, as we'll see later, does not get in the way of frontier formation in early modern Chittagong, which is what we are engaging with here. We are speaking, of course, of a period prior to the expansion of the East India Company's expansion beyond the Himalayas, leading up to rivalries between Britain, China, and Russia, and the 19th century preoccupation with frontier demarcation on the part of colonial administrators, such as Lord Curzon. Now, as Thibaut de Hubert has pointed out, the frontier region between today's Bangladesh and Myanmar is the meeting point of what post-Second World War scholarship defined as South, Southeast, and East Asia. It was and remains today a region of intense circulation of people, goods, and ideas. We'll talk more about these complexities of circulation later, of people and goods, of people as goods, but that's later again. The songs that I'm discussing are a collection of mostly anonymous ballads from the 17th and the 18th centuries, compiled by eminent folklorists in the early 20th century in a bid to preserve Bengal's cultural heritage and to construct a Bengali canon for a nationalist era. I'll draw upon what is called the Purbobongo Gitika, or the Ballads of Eastern Bengal, compiled by Dinesh Chandra Sen and other folklorists and published by the University of Calcutta, thereby shaping the Bengali canon as we know it. Now, these ballads, in the words of Tirthankar Rai, followed the lives of a varied collection of anti-heroes and anti-heroines, such as soldiers, sailors, tribal headmen, etc., and engaged with the economic life of the people. The Eastern Bengal ballads, again, Roy has pointed out, were composed in three distinct regions: Mymensingh, Rangpur, and the Noakhali Chittagong coast. Now, my discussion here is primarily centered around the third cluster. The ballads from their vantage point in the Noakhali Chittagong coast point, and here, if you take a look at this map, I have very helpfully put a large green arrow there. We were looking, this is a map of Bengal in the Mughal period. And there on the farthest corner, you have a Chattogram, which is what we are. And you have that hilly region there marked by the hills. That's what we are dealing with. Those are the Chattogram hill taps, right? They point to a long, and right next to it, we have what is present-day Burma and what at that point of time would have been Arakan. So it points to a long history of ties with this kingdom of Arakan, which controlled the Chittagong port from 1538 to 1666. Now we'll begin the conversation by looking first and foremost at Mughal policy of agrarian expansion. In the words of John F. Richards in The Unending Frontier, when Akbar assumed the throne in mid-16th century, even the broad Indo-Gangetic plain was far from fully settled and cultivated. Wide bands of forests bounded areas of dense settlement and cultivation. These sheltered numerous animals. It also harbored indigenous communities not assimilated into the caste system of the Hindu society. Often, their practices were semi-nomadic. Often, their cultivation practices also involved jhum cultivation, which we'll see later. So the Mughal imperial officials devised various measures to encourage forest clearing in every Mughal province. Forest clearance and human settlement was absolutely central to this policy in order to bring more and more land within the ambit of taxation and securing more produce. This eastward push and the bid to clear forests take on a remarkable shape in the far northeast, in the Bengal Delta, which is of course the region that we are talking about. In what Richards calls the most striking example of frontier expansion under Mughal policy. Richard Eaton has drawn upon Persian sources and texts such as the Sheikh Shubhodaya to point to the role Muslim holy men played in this pioneering eastward extension. Officials actively encouraged the activities of the pioneering Muslim peasants And it was human intervention that transformed the forest lands of the region to the docile paddy fields producing golden rice harvest that we know today. And the pioneers pressed on eastwards. I use the language of frontiers and pioneers very deliberately, despite the difficulties posed by the Luso-Arakanese slave raids on the peasant settlements, which would lead to the expulsion of the Portuguese from the thriving port at Hooghly. We'll speak more about this in a minute. But for now, allow me to point out that, like in all pioneering narratives, the forest clearing, the expansion of settlements, wet rice cultivation did not come on terra nullius or empty land, but rather it came into direct conflict with indigenous communities of the region who performed jhum cultivation. The mountainous, deeply forested terrain of what is known today as the Chittagong Hill Tracts was where, again, if I may quote Shirishad Chaudhuri, the agrarian cultures of Bengal began to seed ground to the tribal societies of the Riyangs, the Chakmas, and the Kukis. Now, it's quite beyond the scope of this paper to engage with the present-day histories of coexistence and violence in post-colonial contexts. But if we turn to a ballad like the Kafin Chora, this is a screenshot and an excerpt from there, this conflict gets a clear shape as the balladeer speaks of the Arakanese residents of the region, the Rozanga, and the hill tribes in terms of revulsion, seemingly breaking down the distinction between the human other and the animal world. To the east of Chatiga, we are told, lie high mountains, populated by countless animals. There is a brief catalogue of the animal species, and from there, it's a seamless transition into the indigenous communities of the region, the Rosanga, or the Arakanese converts to Islam, the forest tribes, the hill tribes, the Murung, or the indigenous communities of Tripura, the Chakma, the Kuki, who also receive an additional adjective, naked. This seamless transition from the animal population to the other residents who, it is alleged here by the balladeer, they'll stab the humble Chatiga residents in the chest at the first opportunity. It appears to suggest deep suspicion and animosity. Now, it is worth noting that despite the animosity and the suspicion, the balladeer points to trading ties between the forest residents or the Jongolis and the plainlanders or the Bhuyer Manush. The balladeer also has some words of grudging praise for the gold that the land produces, despite jhum cultivation method that the indigenous communities prefer, as opposed to the wet rice cultivation methods. In Hati Khedar Gan, or the Ballad of Chasing the Elephant, curiously, the indigenous and the Bengali peasants come together to chase the elephants away from the farmland. It is a curious union, made possible in the face of a larger non-human other that destroys the cultivated land. Mongla the Mog, the elderly Saldar of the Chakma village, offers hospitality to the elephant dealers, to the elephant chasing party of Golbodon Mia, pointing to his expertise and experience with the elephants. The lack of large, and here is an excerpt that says this, Beporda Maya, Mainsar Laj Sorom Nai. The lack of large sorom on the part of the women of the Chakma village is spoken of with a mix of suspicion and derision on the part of the balladeer, who nonetheless notes the beauty of the village, as well as the fact that when elephant hordes descend, both Pahari and the regular kheti of the Bangali suffer. In their work on the elephant corridors of the Yunnan, Myanmar, Bengal landscape, Ombika Ayadurai and Shayan Banerjee point out that borderlands can be discussed from non-human perspectives. They point out that elephants in particular have played a major role in shaping the landscape in South Asia, they argue, both materially and symbolically. And this is evident in Hati Khedar Gan as well, where the balladeer speaks of the white elephants and their value in Arakan and beyond. Elephants, furthermore, have used these contiguous forests in this landscape for thousands of years, if not longer, traveling and residing in an area that stretches from Vietnam to the foothills of the Himalayas and into the southern part of the Indian subcontinent. These forests are now heavily fragmented. Even as the Mog, the Chakma, and the Bengali peasant come together to protect the ever-expanding agrarian frontier and human settlements, despite existing conflict, We are reminded of the non-human other and their place in the frontier. Ironically, the same frontier now serves as an important role in the trade of the dead animals as well through illegal means. Now, switching our attention to the figure of the Rozanga, or the Arakanese/Mog peasant. In his work on the Chittagong frontier, Rishad Chaudhuri places the period of the 1660s as an era that marks the birth, consolidation, and abiding afterlife of the Chittagong frontier. Now, these events, as he points out, featured the dramatic war of succession fought by Shah Jahan's four sons in 1658, leading to the escape of Prince Shah Shuja, then the governor of Bengal, to Mrauku in Arakan through Chittagong. And Shuja would eventually die mysteriously in Arakan, following a period of considerable political tussle with the king. Shuja's death, and in 1666, Aurangzeb's armies would once and for all claim Chittagong from Arakan. It would mark Mughal political consolidation in the region and the construction of the region as a frontier to a political frontier to Arakan. Now, Shuja's death, as Chaudhuri has rightly observed, was linked to frontier formation in popular memory, recounted in ballads of the region as a lamentable event. For instance, in Shuja's daughter's lament, I've quoted it here, Shuja Tanayar Bilap, we speak of her fate in the hands of the Arakanese other, as imagined in rural Bengal. Again, she has difficulty eating there. She speaks of the food and the customs in terms of outright disgust. While in Poribanu's Hawla, or Poribanu's lament, the balladeer tells Poribanu, this princess, to not travel west. And there is this very tragic refrain, na jayo pori rosangar deshe. And it comes back to Shagore Dubaili pori re, you drowned pori in the sea. That is to say, it was almost that she was left to drown. It would suffice to say that the consolidation of the political frontier of the Mughal state in this period finds articulation in these songs, especially in the literary afterlife of the Mughal prince and his family in the popular imagination. As Chaudhuri has pointed out, the rural ballads may have lacked the precision of the Indo-Persian writings to make sense of the frontier, but they unmistakably pointed to the perceived limits of the Chittagong by commemorating a great conflict that took place between Shuja and Arakan. The conflict unfolded somewhere beyond the limitless sea. I would like to build on this invaluable insight and point out that even as the balladiers point to the limits of the frontier, to the alien land on the west, populated by others, their food, culture, costumes spoken of in terms of visceral disgust and othering. The ballad sense of the Arakan frontier, of existence in a zone at the periphery of political control, is further constituted by their exploration of their ties among the people and the different forms of coexistence. A significant aspect of these ties is commercial, featuring sailors, merchants, businessmen of all hues. So trading communities such as fish and rice. In the ballad Nasar Balum, for instance, Nasar gets involved in business with an Arakani businessman and goes to obtain the famous Loita, or the Bombay duck of Poridia, where the ferries used to roam. Nasar is also infatuated with the businessman's daughter, pointing to the existence of sexual marital ties between the Bengali and the Arakanese communities. In Nurunneha and the Tale of the Grave, the Rozanga peasants are in fact praised for being very hardworking. Now, the presence of Rozanga peasants in Chittagong is unsurprising. It is given the long history.
Recording in progress.
Given the long history of Arakan control of this region, King Narupati Kri, he in fact had a policy which which involved the depopulation of Chittagong and repopulating it with Arakanese people, because he feared that Chittagong was emerging as a rival power center. Now, this would lead to mass deportations, especially of skilled artisans from Chittagong, as Dutch sources have revealed. Narupati Kri also brought people from the Chittagong region as slaves and resettled them in Arakan as a part of royal service groups. Michael Charny, in his work, has attempted to make an estimation of the number of Bengali captives brought to Arakan in the 17th century, arguing that this period marked the Banglasization of Dhannobati. Noropathikri had in fact forbidden the Dutch VOC from buying slaves who knew a trade at this point of time. Now, this question of slavery also merits brief discussion, as have been hinting at for so long, considering its significance in the ballads that we have discussed so far. Both Shuja's daughter's lament in the earlier slide, as well as Porumanu's lament, speak of the figure of the Harmat, the dreaded Portuguese pirate. In Nuruneha, the fearsome pirates indulge in unscrupulous looting and marauding, while the terrified boatmen tremble. They drown the boats, they abduct the sailors, they raid Rongdia, they loot the villagers, and they abduct the heroine. Harmat, a term used to refer to Portuguese sailors, is used interchangeably with pirates or Jolodoshu here. In Nosor Malum, again, just a minute, I'm unable to hear. This is an excerpt from Nosor Malum. The Mog or the Arakanese pirates visit the humble home of the peasant Gofur. They capture Nosor. They claim all the cargo of the Loita or the Bombay duck, and they sell him as a slave in Arakan. And look at the description here. It's a land, it's an achanak desh, it's a strange country, Mainshe Manush bechi khaye, where people sell other people. The circulation of people in the frontier then was not necessarily free and voluntary, but also would involve elements of such unfree labor, unfree movement. This history has left its imprint in the Bengali language, with the phrase Mogen Mulluk, literally meaning the land of the Mogs, coming to mean a land defined by anarchy and lawlessness, and Harmad becoming synonymous with pirate. The voices of Nosor and Runneha in the ballads then represent the voices of the countless unnamed victims of the slave trade in Bengal and adjacent regions, a practice that continued well into the 19th century in different forms. Now, I will conclude now. I see Garima on the screen, so I realize I've spoken enough. I want to simply sum up by saying that the ballads from Eastern Bengal, compiled as they were in the 19th and the early 20th century, in a bid to build a Bengali canon, in a bid to offer a glimpse of an authentic agrarian domain for a nationalist audience, offer us important insights into the frontier of the Chittagong frontier, and offer us insights into certain conflicts, certain issues of movement, of migration, of mobility that continue to remain significant in present-day India, Bangladesh, and Myanmar, even today. I'll pause with this, and I'll thank you for being with me all this while.
Thank you so much, Swati. And on that note, she has engaged us with notions not only of the frontier as they take shape in these songs that she has shared with us, and she has explored these contours of shifting borderlands, the conflict between and the collective existence of its human and non-human inhabitants. But most importantly, I feel that such papers not only make us relive an era we missed, but also shares the rich history that is hidden in these by these indigenous communities. Culturally fumed, her talk, especially these ballads that she talks about, they're full of the ethos of the time. Not only that, Swati, you have also bridged the gap, the language gap that we have, especially since as an audience, I don't know Bengali, even though it is one of the sweetest languages that we have. So thank you. Any questions for the speaker, please? No questions? Yes, Priyanka, please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Garima, and thank you, Swati, for a fantastic presentation as usual. I was curious to know about a little later period, especially during the Second World War, and the perception of the Mog in the Bengali imagination, and what role these texts play in kind of in circulating this idea of the Mog as the violent other. So do you have any examples of writings from the early 20th century leading up to the Second World War where this identity is being foregrounded?
Thank you for the question, Priyanka. Though I must say that the 20th century, especially the Second World War, is too late a period for me to truly care about, as you know very well. But nonetheless, on a very serious note, that's a fantastic point that you make. And I think it would require, which I have not done, very honestly, it would require some very interesting insights following the Burmese expulsion of Indians and the period that followed of the resettlement in Eastern Bengal. This is a comparison that I have not looked at. Again, too late a period for me to really look at. That said, there is one fantastic example of the formation of the Burmese people in Bengali writing, always in Bangla, and that is Srikanto, where Sharat Chandra Chatterjee often speaks of the Burmese community in both terms of revulsion as well as admiration. He admires how hard the women work, but he often describes them, both in Srikanto as well as in Pother Dabi, in terms of visceral disgust, which seems to sort of play into the tropes that we already see that are fairly well established in narratives such as this. But that is all I have to offer here, because there is not a lot of the 20th century that I have considered here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Swati. Priyanka, I hope that answers your query. And before we proceed further, yes, Priyanka.
Yes, it does. And if I may be allowed just a couple of seconds to direct Swati to another text, which I have read, but I know her interest lies in much earlier period in medieval Bengal. But Swati, a novel by the dancer, writer, and also an IPTA cultural activist, Bulbul Chaudhary, he is writing about, he's building this fiction in his novel called Prachi by simply looking at refugees, Bengali refugees coming from Myanmar. And it gives a very palpable description of the mosque.
I think we lost her audio. Yeah.
Violence, but also women, being raped, Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Swati, can you unmute?
Yes.
Yes. I can hear Priyanka now. Yes. I'll take a look at Prachi then.
Yes.
Great. So on that note, I would like to share with all the audience members here present this evening that we will have a feedback form at the end of this session. So we will be sharing it in the chat box. Do share your feedback with us. And on that note, let me invite our next speaker, Dr. Shairi Datta. She's an assistant professor in the Department of English at Surendranath College, University of Calcutta. She is a part of CES, the Center for English Studies at JNU in the School of Language, Literature and Culture Studies. And her work focuses on the public intellectual roles of V.S. Naipaul and Salman Rushdie. I think we should all gear up because her current area of interest is in the history of Indian indenture migration to the Caribbean and the Indo-Caribbean literature and culture. I welcome you, Shairi.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the organizers, particularly as Shatidi has already pointed out, particularly to Madhuri for organizing this extremely fascinating conference. The title of my paper, Coolie Depots in Literatures of Indenture Migration, I would like to begin with the disclaimer that my title is deliberately misleading. As sites of making and unmaking of the coolie identity, the depots at Calcutta or Madras mark the culmination of a longer and more disruptive process of colonial stratification. Following the 1833 Act of Abolition of Slavery in British colonies, slave laborers had to continue serving for a transitional period of apprenticeship until 1840, during which time plantation owners in the Caribbean and Mauritius devised other means to maintain control over their workforce. A January 4th, 1836 letter from John Gladstone, a Liverpool merchant, slave owner and politician, addressed to his nephew at Gillanders, Arbuthnot and Company, a Calcutta shipping agency, expresses the merchants' interest in recruiting Indian laborers for the Caribbean through the shipping company. Citing this letter, Madhavi Kale writes, and I quote, "In their efforts to challenge Afro-Caribbean workers' position in local labor markets and undercut their ability to bargain effectively for higher wages and better conditions, planters sought workers from neighboring colonies. Thus, Indian workers were recruited, among many others, to be scabs," close quote. What follows is the official codification of Indian workers in the British Caribbean as a counterpoint to the lazy, unreliable black worker. Interestingly, an emphasis on essentialized images of docility and industriousness is perpetually undercut by what is also seen as the Indians' propensity for avarice, jealousy, idolatry, dishonesty, violence, and a lack of physical prowess. The arbitrariness of racial taxonomies operating as the basis of labor in plantation economies point towards a colonial archive in crisis. Labor in the extraction ecologies of the Caribbean demands that the laboring body be seen in its utilitarian capacity. Yet, codes of efficiency are equally dependent on remembering and reinstituting essential cultural differences within a plural society. To understand, for example, the persistence of strategies of competitive victimhood underscoring Afro-Trinidadian and Indo-Trinidadian politics in the Caribbean region, both before and after the independence, it is necessary to undertake a return journey. With reference to the history of Indian indenture, the objective is to probe the sustainability of the coolie identity, both in its pejorative and subversive senses, by examining the interstitial narratives of becoming a coolie. Now, Gayatri Bahadur, in her book Coolie Woman, traces the evolution of the coolie label from its first usage in the late 16th century by Portuguese captains and merchants along the Coromandel coast of India to denote the men who carried loads at the docks, to its broader lexical definition of an unskilled laborer employed cheaply, especially from Asia. In the 1830s, the term came to be identified with the indentured laborers recruited by the British government to work on the colonial plantations. As a homogenizing tactic, the label sought to erase caste class distinctions while signifying what Bahadur calls lowliness in the hierarchy of a sugar estate, a hierarchy based on race. Bahadur sees the coolie identity both as a permanent inheritable marker of ethnicity as well as a term which has responded to the dynamic shifts in the histories of the Caribbean, from its potency as a racial slur to its reclamation in the literatures of the region. And we have various examples such as Rajkumari Singh's I Am a Coolie, and we also have Khal Torabuli, a Mauritian and French poet who sort of creates this aesthetic category called coolitude, Mahaday Das, and so on and so forth. The dynamism of the word vis-a-vis the recruitment of indentured laborers alludes to the inefficiency of what Hugh Tinker calls the technology of emigration, which was launched by the British administration both as a supplement to the plantation economy as well as a system far removed from the excesses of slavery. Following protests and bad press, both in England and its colonies, against the inhumanity of the system of slavery, the next phase of labor recruitment becomes a thoroughly self-conscious, nervous exercise. Thus, ethical considerations are embedded within the urgent economic needs of the empire, and it is at this discursive juncture that the coolie identity is formulated and challenged. In my paper, I hope to look at the patterns of displacement which bring the potential laborer to the Calcutta depot. Significantly, the emigration depot as a site of enumeration, codification, and homogenization of bodies is unsettled, and a certain fictiveness comes to qualify the processes of recruitment for the colonies. Thus, a turn towards the fictionalized or unofficial rendering of the coolie experience offers insights into the in-between zones of displacement and identity construction. In this, the site of the coolie depot operates as a nerve center insofar as the government wishes to consolidate a multifaceted image of itself as the epitome of civility, efficiency, and productivity. The emphasis is on the visual aspect of the depot as a site of empire's busy commercial life, bridging land and sea, attesting to its awe-inspiring terraqueous power. Calcutta in particular becomes the desired location for this enterprise because of its connectivity with northern and eastern India's densely populated hinterlands, among other factors. The spectacular impact of the river port is evident in the rapid development of shipbuilding, docking, and repair facilities, and the evolution of a busy trading center accelerated by British private investment in infrastructural development beginning in the late 18th century. Nilanjana Dev notes that by 1840, there were 29 major shipbuilding facilities in the region. Added to this is what she calls the mega commodity of the ship, attesting metonymically to the circuits of power essential to the sustenance of empire. An anonymous article titled The Coolie Emigrant, published in Edinburgh in 1905 as a first-hand European traveler's account of the process of indenture emigration, describes Calcutta as seen by the migrant laborers, and I quote, "Calcutta must be to them a land of wonders, the city of palaces. Many have never seen a ship and are now confronted with the varied and crowded shipping of the Hooghly," close quote. Calcutta is equally evocative of a primal fear of the unknown, especially for migrant travelers from the villages and districts. In Amitav Ghosh's Sea of Poppies, the migrant laborers being transported to the Calcutta depot in a pulvar or a light river boat are unsettled by the changing landscape as they journey downstream. Here, the crossing of an invisible boundary taking them into a watery, rain-drowned land portends the otherness of the port city. Ghosh writes, "The word Calcutta had no sooner been uttered than every window in the Girmitia's pulvar flew open. From their unstable point of view on the boat and looking towards the looming shorefront of the city, the migrants are made aware of an essential dislocatedness." Ghosh writes, and I quote, "On the journey downriver, the pulvar had stopped at so many large and populous towns that urban vistas were no longer a novelty. Yet even the most worldly of the Girmitias was caught unaware by the spectacle that unfolded around them now. The ghats, buildings, and shipyards that lined the Hooghly were so numerous, so crowded, and of such a size that the migrants fell into a silence that was in equal measure awestruck and appalled," close quote. The excessive nature of the port city is equally unsettling for the system of labor recruitment, in that the curious cargo, the precious cargo, is always at risk of being lost or stolen by the voracious city. We will return to this, the Coolie Depot as a site of incarceration, but before that, the migration of the potential laborer must be understood in its context. The system itself speaks of a robust mechanism comprising colonial governments in England and the colonies, immigration agents, sub-agents, recruiters, registering officers, medical officers, overseers, guards, cooks, sweepers, and other employees. Moving upstream and branching outwards into the districts of Bengal, Bihar, and Northwest provinces and Oudh, however, reveals significant breaks in the system. Macroeconomic factors such as increase in taxation, deindustrialization of the agrarian economy leads to the production of a landless peasantry. As Radhika Mahasen notes, the changes in the nature of agriculture in British India turned land itself into an alienable commodity for most of the peasants. Added to this were microeconomic factors such as drought, famine, population density, caste-related atrocities, leading to migration towards other districts, villages, cities, or even overseas. In Ron Ramadin's 2003 novel, Rama's Voyage, Rama's father, a poor farmer who is killed in the Great Mutiny and whose death sets into motion the 12-year-old boy's journey into indenture, attests to yet another minor contributing factor for indenture migration. Significantly, the year 1858 saw a huge number of registrations, although the number of coolies who actually departed for the plantation colonies were lesser. What the system reveals are the corruptions of and within the system. Here, the figure of the Arkati or local recruiter becomes part of the evolving folklore surrounding the complex of indenture recruitment. As an unstable category lurking on the margins of colonial governmentality, the Arkati reveals the inherent irrationality of the indenture program, which cannot operate without the guiding narrative of subterfuge and elision, which the Arkati embodies. In fact, his or her double marginality, insofar as the Arkati hunts on the margins of societies, lends a certain fictive or literary quality to their role. In Edward Jenkins's 1877 romance novel set in the plantations of British Guiana, titled Lakshmi and Dilu, A Study of West Indian Life, the Arkati is described as a stranger, a Bengali, arrayed save as to his turban and pajamas in an imitation of a European uniform. Across his shoulders, he wore the chapras or the badge of official employment. He has the air of a man shrewd and traveled, a touch of town culture. He evokes great interest among a group of curious natives who sit around him and watch the theatrics involved in his slow extraction of a piece of paper from under his turban, from which he reads to them his role as the bearer, who has been duly licensed by the protector of emigrants in Calcutta to recruit persons who were willing to emigrate. Promises of inestimable benefits and boundless riches are qualified by the idea of light labor, what he says, like tending to your own garden work. Jenkins' novel, set within the framework of a plantation romance, is not incongruous. In fact, the romantic figure of the Arcati mimics the romance of empire suggested by the myth of plenty, or the paradise of labor which is fed to the natives. At the same time, realities of an incongruous intercontinental system presents itself. A clear connection is established between the misinformation given to potential coolies regarding the nature of their work and consequent instances of disorder and rioting at the plantations. Thereafter, the Office of the Protector of Emigrants is created in 1843 by the East India Company's Court of Directors for regulating the process of emigration. Similarly, the role of the magistrate in the district also becomes a contentious topic among recruiters who often complain about his high-handedness. Within the narrative of internal conflict and subterfuge, the role of a number of decoy birds, as Tinker calls them, hired during the train journey from districts to the main depot, tellingly involves keeping the potential coolies committed to their decision to emigrate. On the other hand, the question is, can the formation of the coolie identity be seen through this lens of decoy and subterfuge? With regard to women, Gayatri Bahadur, of course, has reflected on the caste composition, age, and marital status of the women who would journey into indenture. Often indentured labor would be recast as escape from patriarchal confines of family and society, both for the prostitute as well as the Brahmin widow. At the same time, an overlaying paternalistic logic of colonialism would insist that women signing up for indenture to plantations must seek the permission of their husbands, if alive. Instances of kidnapping by recruiters were also rife. Indeed, violence against women on the plantation attests to the persistence of patriarchal codes of honor. Yet, other kinds of female coolie subjectivities are also possible. In Amitav Ghosh's novel, for example, Diti and Kalua's escape from the caste patriarchy nexus is enacted along the riverway, where greater freedom is associated with a further departure from the hinterlands of their specific communities. Diti's journey is characterized by enterprise. She barters her silver nose ring at a riverside hut for some food. Later in the hold of the Pulvar, she recalls her forgotten maiden name as part of her efforts at disguise. Aditi, wife of Madhu, my husband and I at Chamars. Here the city offers fantasies of anonymity. Characteristically, her first glimpse of the coolie ship Ibis grants her an intimation of her centrality within the new narrative. As the text says, this vessel that was the mother-father of her new family, a great wooden Maibab, an adoptive ancestor and parent of dynasties yet to come. If the Calcutta depot functions as a kind of final frontier in the internal migratory trends of potential coolies, then what were the contours of this frontier zone? The depots would be normally leased for 10 years. In 1908, the main depot at Garden Reach on the Calcutta waterfront was leased from the British India Steam Navigation Company at the sum of £600 per annum. As a site of incarceration, the depots were mostly constituted by identical barracks with arrangements for cooking, makeshift hospitals and dispensaries. However, in the 1870s, following complaints from planters about health issues among coolies in the plantations, the government of India launched an investigation and enacted the Indian Ordnance Act of 1883. The emphasis was on the management of the depots and the health of the laborers, for which the entire system of rudimentary healthcare was brought under the scanner. The diseased body thus becomes the antithesis of the functional labor economy, and the coolie depot exceeds the limits of its own functionality by turning into an epicenter of outbreaks of cholera, dysentery, diarrhea, fever, smallpox, etc. Simultaneously, the health crisis illuminates the arbitrary nature of examination conducted by medical officials and the inadequacies of Western medical practices. The depot in itself is a precarious place for the authorities insofar as it does not ensure absolute incarceration. In Sea of Poppies, the inmates of the Mauritius depot near Tolly's Nala are encircled by, and I quote, the spectators and camp followers who lurked perpetually outside the camp fence, vendors, vagrants, and urchins, in whom the sight of the Girmitiyas inflamed an inexhaustible curiosity, close quote. The potency of rumors here circulated by these shadowy figures of the city attests to the essential fictiveness of a system which itself relies on secrecy and deception. At the same time, the curious category of the Girmitiya refuses to reveal itself completely, thereby adding a further layer to the palimpsestic history of the port region. Thus, the depot becomes a site where the making and fixing of the coolie is constantly interrupted by other modes of articulation. Not only does the city keep spilling into this space, but the coolie themselves are always in excess of their labor roles. They negotiate with their coolie identities differently, as when the inmates of Ghosh's novel offset their fear of departure by recalling older identities, finding it easier to speak of the details of religious rituals and to plan them minutely. Rama's voyage is also replete with references to modes of colonial signification. For example, on arrival at the depot, the making of the coolie is ritualized by the dip in the river and the wearing of identical clothes. Passes and tin tickets are issued to each coolie and checked by the protector of emigrants before embarkment. However, these attempts at initiating the coolie into a certain penal regime are undercut by the government's own efforts at grounding indentured labor recruitment in a narrative of consent. Crucially, the purported logic of communication has to contend with the high incidence of illiteracy among the recruited who were made to put their thumbprints on indenture agreements. In the anonymous colonial observer's first-person account cited earlier, the double line of empty plates piled with savory mess at the depot is subverted by references to the emigrants making merry with weird music till the chowkidar interrupts them. So I close with these questions. What gets interrupted in the processes of labor migration and the constitution of a certain coolie identity within the framework of a colonial economy? What do these frontier sites offer both as a brief interlude in the journey towards indenture as well as a zone of uncertainty for both colonizer and colonized? Finally, what function do these literary interventions serve in imagining the coolie as something more than what the archive gives us? I leave you with these questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shairi. You've actually made us relive not only, certain sections of the society that we kind of not even think about and overlook. Any questions for the speaker, please? Yes, Swati.
Right. Shairi, thank you very much for the wonderful paper, and I'd definitely love to hear and read more of your work on this particular topic. Looking at I was stuck at one particular point on the figure of the Arkathi or the indentured. The pin figure, if I may.
Yes.
What I wanted to ask, because you moved on from there very clearly. How did was this particular figure necessarily a figure based in Calcutta or the districts, or would this figure be also from other regions, such as the so-called Upper Bengal at the time, which is present-day Bihar? So how were they located and where were they recruited from? I mean, who recruited the Arkathis? That's my question.
Thank you so much, Shatidi. So what was very, very significant to the recruitment of the Arkathi was their familiarity with the local population, that they would, of course, in a lot of sense, they needed to have their finger on the pulse of these people, because they would usually, as I mentioned, hunt on the peripheries. So people who have been, for example, women who have been sort of absolutely left to fend for themselves by their families because they have become widows, or women who are probably traveling as part of a pilgrimage group and who would be then taken to the side. So having a finger on the pulse of these vulnerable, shifting kind of populations would be something that would be given to people who had a certain sense, if not absolute familiarity with the people. But when I looked at references to, for example, in Benares, the kind of recruitment that would go on, then clearly these were people who were very familiar with the landscape, with the topography. They were very, very familiar. For example, this particular reference that I made here to the anonymous article, The Coolie Emigrant of 1905. So the historian Brijlal refers to this when he says that clearly they were very aware of the pilgrimage season. the festival. And therefore, that would be the time when they would be lurking around these festival zones, because that is when these, and he says that this would be the time when people would be, in a way, separated from the safety and security of their communities. So then they are easier to prey on. And then, of course, all the subterfuge, all the stories of, the golden land would be fed to them. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Any more questions? Thank you so much, Shairi, for sharing this with us. And on that note, let me call our next speaker, Gaurav Ghosh, who teaches literature at the School of Liberal Arts at Narsi Mohanji Institute of Management Studies, Mumbai. He completed his post-graduation in English literature and MPhil in English and Cultural Studies from JNU. He's also currently pursuing his PhD in theatre studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics here in JNU itself. He's a theatre artist and has acted and directed in various plays in Bengali, Hindi, and English. He's also a recipient of Fulbright and Charles Wallace India Trust Fellowships. He has performed both in the US and the UK during his fellowships. He has a few publications in books, journals, and newspapers to his credit. Welcome, Gaurav. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Garima, for introducing me. And I hope I can share the screen.
Absolutely. There's a share screen button on the bottom.
Can you see the screen?
Oh, we are just waiting. Yes, we can.
Okay, great.
Great. So the stage is all yours.
Thank you. So from frontier songs to labor, my paper is on performance and partition. I don't know how much I will do justice to the word partition. Definitely, I will speak a little bit on Jatra and my case study, which is Nato Company, which is shut now in West Bengal. So the title of my paper is The Story of Nato Company, Partition, Displacement, and Jatra. This is the photograph that you are seeing on the first slide is actually Nato Company's house or office, that you can say, which is 17 Harchandra Mallik Street in Kolkata. Before I go into the paper, I would like to, some of you know about Jatra or Bengali Jatra, but what is Jatra? For those who don't have any idea about Jatra, Jatra is a folk performance form of Bengal or, of Bangladesh also, like other folk performance forms like Bhavai, Yakshagana. So it's a very popular performance form, a mobile performance form where troops move from villages to villages with a particular show and shows and perform in front of audience. The audience base is mostly the rural audience. Now, Jatra is performed in present-day Bengal, Orissa, Assam, and in Bangladesh, and it varies in style, in terms of styles of acting, in terms of props, in terms of its setting. Now, in present-day West Bengal, Jatra is performed both in open-air performances, also in theatre halls. You can see this sketch that I'm showing, where audience is almost seated on four sides, and there are two actors who are performing, and you can see on the left side there is this group of people who are sitting, and they're perhaps the musicians, or what we call in present day orchestra party. And the props is very minimal. It's very interesting to note that Orissa Jatra has very elaborate setting and light design, whereas Bengali Jatra only there is a prop, which is the rostrum, which is the three steps or just a chair, which can be taken from a stone to the throne of a king. Now, the style of acting is melodramatic, very high, loud acting with, and it's also to captured the attention of the audience. The range of the audience will be now for a very popular Bengali Jatra that I have watched a few years back, not recently, would be between 3,000 to 6,000. It can vary like that. More or less, the audience size is always between 500 to 800. And the themes are religious, historical, social, and political. This is a very brief introduction to the Jatra form. Now, we are talking about partition here. The theme of the conference is from partition to pandemic. And I thank Madhuri, the convener, to come up with such an interesting CFP, and the college to also organize this. But when we talk about Jatra, I thought that we should also try to have a little bit of sense of what is pre-partition Jatra. Now, Jatra troops before partition of Bengal as well as partition of India used to travel to Tripura, Assam, Bihar, and they used to travel extensively. Jatra troops from the districts from present-day Bangladesh, they would travel, they would cross Brahmaputra, and they would travel to Lower Assam, Upper Assam, Bihar, undivided Bihar at that time. And the season was, and it is still, from July during Rath Yatra to May, mid-May, this is the season of Jatra. So, when the time that I was talking about, the performers were all male performers, not a single woman we would see on stage, particularly when it comes to Jatra. Now, it is interesting to know, and Sumanta Banerjee writes in his book, Color and the Street, that in the later half of the 18th century and the early half of the 19th century, due to famine, we see migration happening from different parts of rural Bengal to the city Kolkata. Now, they also bring with them a rich repertoire of performing arts, the forms, and these folk forms mix with Bengali Jatra form. And Bengali Jatra gives birth to a new style of Jatra, and that is called sometimes theatre, sometimes called Jatra opera. One of the most controversial and interesting pala of that time is Vidya Sundar, which brought in, quote unquote, the low culture folk performance forms like Keur, like like a certain form of dance forms which are not really allowed perform in very elite circle, but it became very popular. This Jatra form, which is a mixed bag, bag of full of other folk forms, became very popular among the Bengali elites. Slowly, when the theatre started growing in Calcutta city, Jatra was pushed to the periphery, almost Birbhum and Bardhaman districts, and Calcutta was almost free from Jatra performances. So this is very interesting for us to note that by 1900, by 1878, we don't see much Jatra happening in Kolkata city. Now, around 1904-5, we know that the Swadeshi movement, the partition of Bengal, that was extremely, as a political movement gained its momentum. Jatra also participated in it. It is very important to note Jatra from the other side, that is from Borishal, Faridpur district, participated in Swadeshi movement. And one of the most important names, that come to our mind is Mukund Das, and a photograph you can see, who is known as the rebel poet or the rebel minstrel or the rebel singer, and Mukund Das would dress up in this saffron turban and saffron robe and would come on stage, and suddenly and abruptly he would come on stage and suddenly sing patriotic songs, and people would come and give their jewelries. And these are all recorded, in police files by spies and of the British government. And Mukundas became very popular, as this Swadeshi, and as his form of Jatra, which is known as Swadeshi Jatra, which almost retained its popularity till 1936-37. Now, when we come to partition, around 1946-47, happen, we also have to keep certain things in mind, that the performances that are documented in police records by spies recruited by by British police, British Raj, the partition of Bengal vis-a-vis partition of India. When we come to know about partition of India and what happened to Jatra during that time, perhaps there is nothing written on it. There is nothing written that what happened to the partition of what happened to Jatra during the partition. Now, I have gone through police records in West Bengal, but I have not come across any such piece which talks about Jatra performing artists are also traveling with the refugees and crossing borders and coming here. We come to know about the refugee crisis within the Jatra industry when we talk to people. It's like anecdotes, not something official which is there. It is some questions also come to our minds. What happened folk performances during partition? There are more than 1,000 folk performances in Bengal, and this is undivided Bengal I'm talking about. So the effect of partition, how it affected the folk performers, that is also not documented. So when we talk about the migration, the refugees, the settlers, we don't find enough people, who are talking about their profession, particularly if they are coming from folk performance background. So my question that I want to ask, because I don't have the answer, that is it possible to write partition history without looking at the folk performances or performers? Perhaps it is not. Perhaps it is missing and someone has to do this work. Now, partition also brought women in Jatra. It's very interesting because women came as refugees and they want some kind of employment for their family, for themselves also. Now, Jatra slowly opened its door for women performers. First, as child performers, as girl children, they would go and perform in several small dance batches. And then we know about Josna, the first rising queen of Bengali Jatra, who was a woman by birth and assigned also at birth, and she became the first heroine of Bengali Jatra. Now, when we come to Nato Company, which was stationed at 17 Harachandra Mollik Street, family still stays there. It's called Putul Bari, a very famous house in Calcutta. So what happens is that Jatra in East Bengal or East Pakistan at that time was very popular in Dhaka, Faridpur and Borishal districts. And they became the cultural centers of the late 19th century, where Jatra companies flourished and carried out their performances. Now, Dr. Singhorai Company was a famous Jatra troupe of East Bengal at that time. With time, this troupe was dissolved into different Jatra troupes like Nath Company, Rudra Company, Singho Company, Gohorai Company, Lady Company, and Nath Singho Company. These companies gradually became famous due to their successful performances of Jatra Palagan in East Bengal. Thakur Company was also a famous company of Borishal, and Shoshi Notto was a famous tabla player as well as a small shareholder of this company. In 1912, this company was closed and Shoshi Notto was clueless about his job and future. Ambika Nath Company wanted to buy all the goods and rights in sale. Shoshi Notto managed to get some old costumes, rusted properties, and a broken boat. We have to understand Bangladesh is a land of rivers and rivulets, and they used to perform, they used to rehearse on boats. It's a fascinating anecdote we come across when we talk about Jatra in East Bengal. Vaikuntha Notto was a wealthy and popular violin player of Machang village of Borishal district. He was the grandfather-in-law of Shoshi Notto's brother, Haron Notto, who was a popular singer of Jatra. Vaikuntha Notto helped Shoshi Notto financially, and a new Jatra troupe was formed, which he named as Machrang Vaikuntha Sangit Samaj, which in turn came to be known as Nato Company post-partition. Now, my entire this paper is born out of my MPhil, which was basically writing the history of Nato Company, and this information, I got through long interviews with Makalal Nato, who is no more with us, and but he kept. So I asked him that what is the meaning of Nato? So he said because people who would play tablas or who sing kirtans, because Nato Company, Machram Boikunta Sangit Samaj, which was formed and later which became Nato Company post-partition in Kolkata, its main objective was to sing songs. We used to sing kirtans, and that's how they got the name Nato Company. Now, post-partition, around 1936 onwards, Natos used to come and perform in present-day West Bengal, Kolkata, Assam, Tripura, but very few performances they used to do. But post-1940, from 45, they started moving to Calcutta city. Post 47, 48, so all the family members moved from Borishal district to Kolkata district. And Makalal Nato enrolled himself many times in colleges because he wanted to become a scientist. He landed up become a Jatrawala. And that story started in 1952 after the demise of his father, that how he became the proprietor of the famous Nato Company of Bengali Jatra world, which is still known for, it is no more functioning, but it is a great troupe that everyone respects. And we'll come to know about the 17 Harachandra Malik Street soon. So post-partition, the Nato Company, we see the refugee boy, Makanlal Nato, becoming the proprietor in 1952. And it's very interesting to know that he was joined, by Subha Kumar Datta, by other, he says that, people who actually helped him after his father's demise was Rajendra Lal Nato, his uncle, Satish Nandi, manager of the troupe, Narayan Chandra Nato, cashier, and Rabati De, the female impersonator. So they helped him actually understand the business. Now, another important thing that we note also is where the Datta industry is located in Calcutta. They always argue the insider-outsider debate. They never took Nato Company as a company of West Bengal. They have, and when I interviewed Jatra troop managers, they have always said, because Nato also very strategically, also the 17 Harachandra Malik Street, the office and the house of Natos, they were not part of Chitpur as such. And the Chitpur, in Chitpur would say they are not part of us. They're settlers group. They have come from East Bengal and they have settled here. They're refugee group. Their style of acting, their style of doing Datta business, and our style of doing Datta business completely different. And I kept asking, what is difference? What kind of differences you are talking about? It is just difference. They are very different from us. They're outsider. They're not from Bengal. And this has remained until now, this entire insider outsider debate, or this kind of stigma that Nato Company has with it. Now, I have talked with Makanlal Babu about the style of acting. He would say that they have a particular discipline which they had brought with them from the other side of Bengal, after partition, and they would say that we don't gel with the discipline of the Jatra troops here. We have you will see that people would sit on the trunks of their costume and do their makeup. For us, trunks which has the costume in it is very secret. We would never allow our artists to sit on the trunks, So small things that you keep talking about that make difference, that make Nato Company different from other companies from this part of Bengal. Now, another interesting point that the refugee boy Makanlal Nato did, not only for Nato Company but also modernizing Bengali Jatra. He was the first true proprietor or owner who actually gave advertisements in English newspaper and also in Bengali newspaper with photographs. He would make Kolkata elites come and watch his rehearsals and performances and book. This was not possible before he actually became a very famous owner and building a network. Also in 1969, he formed a group called Boikuntho Jatra Samaj, which was mainly to recruit women actors and perform separately from Nato Company, because he never wanted women to come and perform in Nato Company, which obviously after 4 years, it was very difficult for him to run both the companies, and women actors were coming in numbers and joining Jatra. So he dissolved Boikuntho Jatra Samaj, and he actually marched to companies. Nato Company said that. Now, this is more or less a story of Nato Company and my focus, my case study, that how a company a troop which actually after partition moved to Kolkata, how managed to get its own space, and particularly it has a very long and interesting history with the female impersonators. You can see in one of the photographs, Chapol Bhaduri, the last reigning female impersonator of Bengali Jatra. Now, I have a few questions when I was working on this presentation, that what happens, happened actually during partition with these Jatra performers, because I have no idea. So I started looking at the performances now. So as Ukraine-Russia war is happening, we cannot really stay away from the heat of the war. So what I have seen is that in the photograph that you can see, the children sitting, this is a Shakespearean play getting performed in a Syrian refugee camp. Now, this is very interesting for us to note that when we talk about displacement, partition, or migration of workers or people, can we really not look at these performances and write the history of migration? Because another photograph that you can see is Freedom Theatre. It's a theatre group from Palestine, and it keeps performing and obviously bringing the Palestine issue at the front. So how do we document these performances as well as write the history of performances or the history of displacement? This is some of the questions that I want to ask the audience. How do we conceptualize the cultural labor? How do we actually see that performances which are happening during the stages of migration or displacement? So with these questions, I will end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saurabh and Gaurav. And on that note, any questions, please? Yes, Indira. Please unmute yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Indira. I'm a third-year English major from Loreto College, Kolkata. And I had this question, basically. Right now, we're studying about Jatra and Alka. And I find it very interesting considering the angle of female impersonation and that sort of, at least on a certain level, that dissolution of the gender binary that plagues our country, I would say. So what happened to the queer people during partition? That is something that I've always wondered, and I personally haven't had, I haven't found too much information on queerness and the representation of queerness in partition literature as such. And, considering Jatra and Alka, they have this sort of place for a dissolution of that sort of hegemonic gender binary, even if it's on a very fragmentary level. How do we associate queerness with partition, and where do we place queerness in the context of Indian partition?
Shall I answer Indira's? Yeah.
Yes.
So there are references to queerness in poetry, in writings, in partition literature. But Indira, your question is very interesting. If I just focus on your question asking about queerness in performance, it is really, it is missing. There is no such documents or writing that we come across. in Jatra, I can say the queerness in Jatra, because I myself is a queer man, and I perform as a female impersonator also. So the documentary Performing the Goddess, which is on Chapol Bhaduri published from Seagull, it was a first step to actually document queerness in Jatra. There are a lot of anecdotes that we come across when we come to know about female impersonators, how they had relationship with men, their managers, their heroes, but nothing was documented. It was the first documentation, I think, in entire folk performance history in India, when a man is coming and not using the term queer, but of course it's being very honest about his sexuality. And works are happening, but very few, because we have the tradition of female impersonator in India is extremely strong tradition, and we need to unearth these histories. And sadly, very little left to us. But if you are a research scholar, it would be interesting to find out queerness in folk performances in India, whether it was pre or post partition.
Indira,
Thank you so much.
Gaurav has actually given you your research topic as well.
I am actually currently working on this. I was like very interested in trying to find.
You can collaborate with him.
Much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being a part of this conference. We meet again tomorrow. And on that note, there is a feedback form. In case you have not filled it, please go ahead and fill it. Give us your feedback so that we know what to plan next. And have a great evening. And we'll connect tomorrow again for the second day.
Thank you, Garima.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Gaurav. Good night.
Thank you, Garima.
Thanks.
For being such a warm host and a warm chair. I would request you all to log in tomorrow at 9:50 sharp. We have parallel sessions scheduled from 10 a.m. Let's call it a day, because it's been a very, very long day today. All right. Bye-bye. See you all.
Recording stopped.
Thank you, Garima. Take care.
Thank you.